Hello, hello. Can I ask the last of you to take your seat, please? And before we begin, just for formalities, may I also ask you to wear your mask, if you're not doing so already? Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Merode. We're very happy to have you with us here this evening. Tonight we have the great pleasure and honor of welcoming James Vincent. Thank you, James, for accepting our invitation. Yes? Just as a quick introduction, and then James will be talking. James is the CEO and founder of FNDR, which works hand in hand with different founders in order to create a narrative to their brands and really give a voice to their vision to guide and shape their company's futures. He worked for 10 years alongside Steve Jobs, creating the narrative behind Apple's brand and for their products, and then went on to work with other major brands and big founders, including Brian Chesky from Airbnb, Evan Spiegler from Snap, to name a few. He's been with us here in Brussels for the past year, working with a number of amazing European founders and the big brands of tomorrow. And tonight he will be explaining the importance of storytelling behind brands. So without further ado, please give a big round of applause to James once again. And welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Isabella. Well, thanks for having me. I'm going to sit up here on this single chair, and I'm going to try and tell you some stories about some of the experiences I've had. And I'm going to tell them as personal stories, and then I'm going to flip through a few slides, because I think hopefully there's lessons to be learned from them, and hopefully you'll sort of leave this evening with, okay, I've learned a thing or two other than what James's life was like. But I'm also going to thread it, because it's about storytelling, so I'm going to start with my story. My beautiful family's sitting on the front row here, so I'll try not to be intimidated by that. So what does this all mean? So I'll take you back to 1999, and I'm living in New York City, and I get a phone call, do you want to work with Steve Jobs? And, you know, everybody knew something was happening in Silicon Valley around that time, but Apple didn't, you know, it was kind of, was it bankrupt, was it not? Like, you know, it seemed cool, people were driving cars with stickers on the back, but were they going to go up or down? But of course, he was Steve Jobs, right? So, of course, the answer was yes. So as I'm hurtling towards the airport, they're like, oh, you do know the last three guys all didn't last more than a month. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be an interesting ride. And so some of the stories I'll tell hopefully will bring that to life, some of the journey that I spent with him, and then some of the lessons that I learned, both personally about him as a leader, and also about why Apple is, you know, the largest, possibly the most loved brand in the world, or close to. I'm going to guarantee that pretty much the majority of people in this audience have an iPhone in their pocket, apart from my friend John down there, who just decides not to. But mostly, most people that now think different have an iPhone. And so Apple has sort of got into culture and has produced technology that has utterly transformed where we were, let's say 20 years ago, to where we are today. And so it's kind of a good lens as I tell this story to think about what changes we've gone through in the last 20 years. And I'm going to do a little bit of that too. So why don't we get started? I'm going to tell you a story. We'll start with Steve, and I'll do that for a little while, and then I'll tell you some other stories about, I went on to work with Brian Chesky at Airbnb, so I'm hopeful most people in this room also have a relationship with Airbnb, either being a host or being a guest, but it's a very special brand, I think. So it was very purposefully and intentionally built. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about Evan Spiegel at Snapchat. For those parents here, you'll know that your children spend a lot of time on it. What are they doing on there? Why are they on there? How did that brand get created? And then I'm going to tell you a lot more stories through the lens of different founders I've worked with. So if that, hopefully, there'll be some interesting stories coming out of that. So let's go. So this is a picture of Steve when he was in his 20s. And I think it's important, you know, storytelling is about finding an intentional narrative, right? And so when I come on to talk about how we work with founders now, I'll talk about how we try to get to kind of a statement like this, or some sense of what's the dent in the universe you're trying to make as a founder. And Steve didn't need to invent it because he was kind of the godfather of founders. And I would say that technology in the late 90s was really full of technologists. And it really didn't have many humanists inside of it. And so if you bought a computer, it was made by Michael Dell and Bill Gates, right? Or some guy at Compaq or some guy at HP, but these are big companies that, you know, have somewhat, during the course of, HP was a great company at some point back in the 70s and 80s. But they lost sort of a very clear definition of who they were and what they were doing. And so I would argue that Steve brought to technology a humanistic point of view and an approach. And this perhaps is a statement that tries to capture that. So he didn't set out to change the computer industry. He set out to change the way people think creatively. And so I'm going to take you through my version of the history of Apple. Okay, so this isn't the official history of Apple, but it's my version of the history of Apple. So I'm going to do it in 5 steps because I think it's actually a lovely illustration. It stretches 40 years. It's a lovely illustration both of the scope and scale and the impact culturally, and also it gives me permission to tell you little stories about each one of those chapters. So, and perhaps this is a masterclass in like how to build the, you know, biggest, most important business and brand in the world without people hating you, which is perhaps the role that Apple has. So 1984 is where it begins. Apple was created in the 70s. 1984 was the launch of the Mac. And of course, George Orwell's book, very dystopian book about the future, which actually isn't turning out to be the dystopian version of the future that we thought it was going to be. There's another dystopian version of the future, which we'll talk about later maybe, or not. But George Orwell obviously had this sense that there would be this great state that would take over. And the parallel here, I think the best way to describe this step was defining your enemy. And again, I'm not saying every great brand has to go out and define their enemy before they can go on, but it's a wonderful case study in very clearly setting themselves out differently. So at that time, it was actually IBM. So IBM in 1984, right? They had most of the technology, and honestly, most of the technology, a computer was a room in the 70s, right? Hard to believe, because right now you've all got a computer in your room, in your pocket that fits in your pocket. That's more powerful than the computer in the 70s that was an entire room. So, and that's really the story of what I'm about to tell you, right? So you go from, and the Macintosh was the beginning of a small, with a graphical user interface, so it had creativity. So if I go back to being a tool for creative people, Steve Jobs studied typography at college, and he was obsessed with the kerning and the typography of the interface. Well, Bill Gates and Michael Dell were not obsessed with the kerning of the type on the interface. And so you had technology in the hands of technologists and not humanists, and I think Steve managed to be a bit of both. So I don't know, how many people know the 1984 commercial? Is there anybody? Yep, a couple of people. Okay, thought of as one of the sort of most famous commercials of all time, or most respected. Ridley Scott. you have this very dystopian, as if you were all in grey outfits just staring at the screen, and suddenly a woman runs in with her red shorts and a big hammer and throws the hammer at the screen and it all explodes. And on the screen at the end it says, this is why 1984 won't be like 1984. Apple. And everyone's like, what the hell was that? Like, what just happened, right? And it was sort of legendarily on the Super Bowl, which is the big sort of launch event in the US. And it obviously, spread widely since then. But the definition of it was not, obviously, the portrayal of the people was IBM, and this was the red shorts, that's Apple. And Apple's saying, we're going to swing the hammer at the status quo and see what happens. And, I think this is when people started putting Apple stickers on the back of their car, because they're like, I like that brand. That's saying something. It's pretty ballsy. Not a computer in sight. There's a lot between step 1 and step 2, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but Steve gets thrown out of his own company, goes and invents Pixar, creates Next, which is where he invents OS, the operating system, which then becomes the foundation of the Mac operating system. But by 1997, actually, Apple aren't doing that well, and he comes back, and he's like, I just need to find a way to galvanize everybody that believes or had believed in, like, we're gonna succeed. So they did this campaign, and I think perhaps the most popular campaign, certainly amongst creative people that may have ever been created. And it's Think Different, and it's here's to the crazy ones. The people crazy enough to change the world are the ones that do. And it's just a beautiful pieces of footage of, the square pegs in the round hole, the people that think differently. And it was really an anthem for them, and it was saying, we're one of those. We're going to think differently. We're not going to do the way that everyone else is going to do. And so again, in 97, they're almost bankrupt. He puts this big ad out there. There's not a single ad. There's not a computer in this ad, so already we've got no computers in these ads. But you've got a whole tribe of people in adoration of this brand and its role in culture. This is way before anything else, that you would be using today. And so those are the kind of foundational couple of steps. And then we zoom forward, and I join in 2000 and start messing everything up. But so step 3, I'm going to talk about, because I thought the iPod, and so I'm from a very even more rainy place than here, which is Sheffield in the north of England. And I was a sort of rather not very good drummer in a kind of reasonable band that wasn't very good. And but at some point, suddenly I'm in front of Steve, and he's like, we're launching a music product. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I used to DJ at college. He's like, oh, good. Okay, great. I was like, I was the nearest thing to someone that knew something about music. So, and so the iPod was a signal of a change in behavior. Fundamental signal. How many people remember the Silhouettes ads, the big, massive posters, the white earpods, the incredible music, right? The energy of all of those. And that changed, I think, the conversation. And it signaled the future. It said, wait, that, the thing that you're currently using, the Discman that skips and has got 12 songs, or the Walkman that has a mixtape that you made last night, this has got 1,000. Everyone's like, why do I need 1,000 songs? That was actually the first reaction. Why do I need 1,000 songs? Of course, on Spotify, you have 10 million songs right now that you have access to from the cloud. But anyway, back then, that was a big thing to have 1,000 songs in your pocket. So you signal the future. And so you're already saying, okay, well, wait. So through the lens of music, which is a really beautiful way to connect with people, right? Because music is where a lot of emotion is. And so some of you may remember there were commercials with U2. There was a U2 iPod. There was Bob Dylan. There was Coldplay. There was all kinds of crazy people involved in that. And that really changed the trajectory of how Apple connected with culture. And so it had been for the people with the sticker on the back of the car up until around this moment. And the iPod got launched in 2003, And actually, that was the same year that the retail stores started being sold. And let me just talk for a second about the Apple store, because there's one just across the street, right? And so around that time, I remember we had a meeting with Steve Jobs every Wednesday from 1 till 3 for 11 years. And sometimes we got a holiday and sometimes we didn't. Or sometimes we got a call to come back in the middle of the holiday, and sometimes we had to and sometimes we didn't. But that was the rhythm of how we worked. And one day we came in and there were two massive models, and one was a Japanese design of circles and whatever, and the other one was square wooden tables. And of course, you know which one won, so square wooden tables became the Apple. And there's a really interesting story about, because Steve was saying we need to do retail differently. We need to do retail differently. It needs to be a conversation with the people that love technology and make it a human conversation. And so I was working with Lee Clow, who's an amazing creative person, and he's a surfer from California, and he told this amazing story. He said, when I was growing up, the place everyone hung out was the surf store, right? If you would just go to the surf shop because there were videos, you could check where the waves are, all the good surfers were there, they'd tell you where to go, which board to use, you need this wax, and in the meantime you can, sort of admire and think about what you might buy in there. And Lee had this idea, is like, you need that feeling within Apple. And the idea was, think about all these guys that I keep telling you about, mostly guys and gals, but that have the Apple sticker on the back, right? So there's millions of people that love Apple, that are very creative, that are normally in the back of the shop. And the idea was, how do we bring them to the front of the brand? And so Lee's idea was, what if we create a bar? What if we take all those guys that have Apple stickers and call them geniuses? Put them behind the bar, and then when you go in and you go, oh, this doesn't work, it's like, oh, no, it's super easy. Wait, you just click, da-da-da. Oh, okay, cool. Oh, great, right? I mean, normally they just turn it on and turn it off again and it works, but whatever. So, right, and these people are super advocates, and this store stopped becoming a store and became a gathering place of people in an homage to Apple. And this was the original concept. And the Genius store is now changed. It's not a bar. You have to stand in line because there's so many people and blah, blah, blah. But back in the day, it was a very, very intentional concept that the Apple store in every major city would represent an interaction, a conversation, a community of people, and you were talked to in a very human way. And it wasn't a technology conversation. You go in an Apple store, oh, this isn't working. Oh, no, it's fine. Listen, it's just super simple. You just go here, click on that. Like, they're taught to talk that way to you, right? You go in a computer fix store and they go, well, I think it's your CD-ROM, back drive, CRM, DVD, and you go, I don't know what you're talking about, right? They don't use acronyms in an Apple store. They're taught not to. So all of these things, and I could give you a million examples of how all of those decisions were brought together so that Apple is this human relationship. So the iPod comes along, step 3. I better speed up or else we'll never get there. Step 4 is a really funny one. There was someone just sent me an article about the last 400 years of capitalism or something, and there was a chapter apparently about the Mac versus PC campaign, which I need to read and haven't yet. But so again, maybe some people have seen it. It was just run in America, but it was basically this discussion. It was a metaphor between a computer and a Mac. And back then, computers kind of didn't work very well, to be honest. There was like the blue screen of death. There was all this like extra junkware. They kind of didn't work. They're just the whirling thing, waiting, and you didn't know how to fix it because it was DOS with Windows on top. And it was made by a hardware manufacturer that didn't know anything about the software manufacturer, and the software manufacturer didn't know anything about the hardware. Apple, they made it all together. So the software guys talked to the hardware guys and said, oh, let's make it work so that there's no, right? Let's make it interoperable. Let's make it super simple. And so it's a very interesting conversation, and I got used to comments like this from Steve, but at one moment, Steve was like, I'm so tired of the Macintosh market share being 3%. 3%, right? Because everyone was buying the sort of cheap Dells that were direct, and they kind of worked. And Macs, everybody knew Macs were better, but they were a bit more expensive, and computers are sort of don't really work, so why would I pay more for something that doesn't really work, right? So people just didn't believe that Macs were significantly different and actually worked. And so he made this incredible statement to me. He's like, I don't do 3%, I want 90% market share. And we're all looking at each other like, how are we going to do this 3% to 90% market share? Took us 9 months to come up with this campaign. Now, it turned out that his 90% was a very specific 90%, because Steve was always very specific. He wanted 90% of every computer over $1,000. So what he was saying was, ignore all of the commodity stuff. I don't care about any of that stuff. I just want the top end, right? So if you go in business lounges or whatever, there's a lot of Macs, and in general, the Macintosh has managed to get the top end. And really kind of hold the price point. I don't think the price point has really increased significantly. So that was always the ambition, was to set a high bar and then make it more and more achievable. So this was a side-by-side proving that they were better. And so sometimes brands have to do that. They have to, right? So that's the product proving itself. And Steve had this really clear idea that product always needed to make a brand deposit. So if you had a product, what's the brand deposit? I don't just want to do a campaign. How is it adding to the Apple story? So step 5 is the launch of the phone. So many of you have one here. Again, you have to cast your mind back to 2007. So probably, I'm going to guess, if we were in 2007 and you were this audience right now, you would either have a Nokia, where you would be texting a lot, because Europe was texting a lot back then, and the US was a bit late on texting. Or you'd have a BlackBerry if you were a businessman, because you're like, I need my buttons, right? And or you'd have a Palm Pilot if you were like a techie person, but they were supposed to be like smartphones, but they're really kind of stupid phones. So they just had a lot of buttons, but they really didn't do very much. They claimed they did a lot, but they really didn't. And just that very thought that half of the thing was buttons, right, and not a screen, and so you didn't have this ability to interact with your stuff. And so the launch of the iPhone was the single biggest, most important, moment. I would, if you guys get bored, go on and look at the launch of the iPhone from Steve's keynote. I mean, launch of the iPod, launch of the iPad. They're testaments to storytelling. They are just fantastic pieces of distilled, just little nuggets that come out, and then you go, oh, I get it. And so, it was a sort of the culmination of all the way over here where computers were a big room, all the way to 2007, and obviously that's the first iPhone, so it looks a bit clunky right now, but it's like 5 inches or something. It's probably pretty small. I think it was 2G, if anybody can remember that. That's sort of like you have to wind it up in the morning. And we came up with this concept that there's an app for that, because what we had to do was to shift people's notion of how they're interacting with a phone. And so again, the language was super important, and all the way along, you'll notice that the language is super important. You'll notice that the visual is super important, but the language is super important. That's the storytelling, right? 1,000 songs in your pocket. The songs are literally just showing you that data is going to be coming into your phone, your iPod at the time, but we're setting the precedent for downloading data on the cloud in the future. It just works was the interoperability of a system that has hardware and software. There's an app for that. Whoa, this is a totally different way of thinking about it. So I have to hit on an icon, and then I go inside it, and then what? What do I do? It's like, can't I just press a button? It's like, no, it's okay. So we did 350 demo ads. They probably ran in, sorry, they probably got a bit boring by the end, but this is how you turn it on, and this is how you do this, and this is how you do it. Because people were like, I don't know how to do this. And of course, very, very quickly, people knew how to do it. Very, very quickly, 2008, 2009, Uber, Airbnb, all of these massive brands were all created as apps on the iPhone and then on Android, of course, at the same time. And so that was a fundamental shift in technology that we'll probably look back at as you draw a line in the sand and you just say technology shifted into this moment, for good and for bad, right? So we know it's almost too accessible right now, and there are certainly some dangers in that, particularly as a parent, that you think about. But the ambition was to create a tool that everyone had in their pockets that they could so easily just touch and see something very visual and solve a problem. Okay, so that took me about 3 hours to do one slide. So I'm going to try not to stick to that bar. I'm going to go a bit quicker. Okay. So I get asked this question a lot. There's some interesting line spacing that happened up there, but anyway. You know, oh, you work with Steve, so like, what are the things that you learned from him, and like, what do you write? And so I wrote the draft of a book that I decided I didn't want to write, and then, but in the end, Fast Company asked me to write this article, so it came out in September of last year. What are the 5 lessons that you learned from Steve that maybe founders of companies today could learn from? So the first one is build a story. I think we just went through that. So that was a story, right? From inception to creating a foil to telling us what you stand for to presenting the future. Bringing voice to your vision. So what I mean by that is voice is like the tone. It's like, how are you going to do something? When you go in the Apple store, they're going to treat you a certain way. When you call them up, they're going to treat you a certain way. When you check out you go on the website, when you look at the instructions, when you get a box, when you get an iPhone, and you try and pull the thing off in less than 30 seconds, it is vacuum sealed. You cannot do it, right? It is designed to make you go, oh my God, right? You literally can't get it unless you got like rip it or something, but it's designed to be this, oh wow. And so that intentionality is brought to everything. And so the quality, of course, that's built in all of those things coming together, that's the voice. That's the feeling that you get when you walk in the store. That's the combination of every ad you've seen. That's your interaction with the product every day. It's the voice to his vision, which was the thing I said at the beginning, which was it's a creative tool, not just a computer. Product is brand. That's and when I come on to talk about more current founders, I'll talk a lot about that because he was always. Apple's a very product-led company, so every product had to make a brand deposit. He'd be like, I love that, James, it's great, but where's the brand deposit? What's the deposit that a year from now when no one cares about that product, how did it make Apple better? And so we always had to have something, and there should not be a difference between a brand and a product. Your product should be your brand, and your brand should be your product. I think often CEOs today, they go, oh, time to talk about brand now. Let's get the CMO in here and talk about what our brand is. It's like, what were you doing the rest of the day? Everything you do is your brand. So that's the separation of the two is where some of the problems begin. Make the tough calls. You know, one of my favorite phrases from Steve was 1,000 no's for every yes. And sometimes, honestly, in presenting to him, I really feel like that's what I had to deal with, 1,000 no's for every yes. You'd be like, what about no? We've got no, I hate all of that. What about, right? And then 1,000 times later, that's kind of good. Maybe you can do some more work there. Make the tough calls. So he was he was a perfectionist. He drove himself. I would say goodnight to him at 12 o'clock, having talked to him for 4 hours. He's like, we need to solve this. I'm like, okay, great. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. Whatever, 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm on the phone with him. He's like, yeah, I figured it out. So I sent you a note, let's go through it. And like, he'd stayed up all night. And I was obviously not superhuman, so I was just a normal person. So there was definitely making the tough calls, and I'm not sure that business leaders do that every time. And then if that hadn't fallen off the end of the slide, it would have said, what's your role in the world? And I just think companies lose track of their existential role in the world. Who are they? How are they different? If you're going to go work for that company, how is it different? Why am I working for it? How should I behave? How do I reinforce that story? And I just think there's too many bland companies out there. So anyway, I think if you have questions on the Apple story, we can do them after, but I'm going to move on from Apple now because you're probably tired of it. So I'm going to move on to a completely different story. So Steve passed away in 2011. And that was a tough moment for a lot of us. And then a couple of years later, some of those big founders. So I left the company I was working with, and just at a certain moment, I was just like, you know what? Why don't I go meet some founders and see like if that wasn't just like a one-off, right? And so I find someone and they're like, oh, well, and within the space of 2 weeks, I meet 3 founders. I meet Travis at Uber, not a very good founder. Evan at Snapchat, I'll come on to tell you more about him, and Brian Chesky at Airbnb. And so I'm going to tell you the story of Brian Chesky and Airbnb. And hopefully, again, this is a brand that you all have a relationship with, so you'll hopefully recognize some of the things that I'm about to talk about. So again, Airbnb didn't set out to change the way we travel. It changed the way we live through travel. Okay? That should make you think for a minute. So when I worked with Brian, I actually sort of went up and worked in Airbnb 2 days a week for 18 months or so in San Francisco. We were living in LA at the time. And we launched this product called the Trips platform. So think about Airbnb. At the time we started working with them, there was a lot of nervousness around the concept of staying in someone else's home. That's a new behavior. I don't want to stay. What about the nail clippings at the bottom of the bed, or the weird, right? That's what people were thinking. It's like where are the buttons on iPhone? You know, when you make a major behavioral shift, you've got to remind yourself of the major things that come back, and that's what was coming back. It was coming back so people were like, well, what about the guys that have a party in right? That happens like 1 in every 10 million stays. But of course, that's what goes on the front cover of the New York Times. So hosts were getting a bit nervous. The brand couldn't quite convince people I kind of like staying in a hotel and sitting in, right? But there was this fairly strong, again, like Apple, fairly strong bunch of advocates that really believed in Airbnb. And most of them were hosts, right? So hosts are people, I'm sure, is anybody a host here for Airbnb? Is anybody rent? There you go, bunch of hosts. There you go, so you guys know about it more than I do. And it's, so if you're a host, it's two-sided marketplace, right? So the shared economy back in that day where I want somewhere to stay, right? Think about it in comparison with Uber, right? And Uber was not a well-managed company, but it was an amazing idea. You remember that moment where you're like, I really need to get a car right now. And there's lots of cars driving around, but they don't know that I need a car. And there's an empty one driving right past me, right? Or there's a taxi, right? There's a taxi in another street away, but it doesn't know I'm here. But with technology, of course, it knows, and you hit that button, and I bet you all remember that moment where you hit that button and you saw it, oh, it took a left, and it's coming my way, and oh my God, it just arrived, right? 2013, 2014, human magic. You're like, wow. Airbnb was connecting you with, and it's funny, we did a series of spots, but one of them was about Paris, and we ran it in the States because a lot of American tourists actually kind of had a poor relationship with Paris. Like, they loved this idea of the city of lights and love, but they always went there and kind of went to the big American tourist hotel, and then they followed the guide and waited in a long line at the Louvre and were treated like American tourists, right? Because then they all wore their baseball caps on backwards and stood in lines. And we were like, that's kind of silly. Like, there's so much more to discover if you would experience Paris not through a hotel or through a guided tour, but by living in it. And so that word live is the operative word. And so that was the name of the campaign. Don't go there, live there. And so if you'd ask someone before this, you say, where have you lived? And you might say, well, I've lived in Brussels most of my life, but I lived in New York for a year or two. Or I went to London for 3 years, right? Because that's how you would answer that question of live. What we were trying to do was to show the difference between hotels, right, which is a fairly sanitary experience, and what you're really doing when you stay in someone's home whose city it is. You're living there. I'm living there. This is Katrine's place. She's left a little note and a bottle of wine, and it says, don't forget, Jean at this corner does a really good in the morning, and you should go get dinner down at so-and-so and tell him I sent you, and, make sure you go there. Don't go to the Louvre. certainly, because that's silly, like you just stand in line with all the tourists, but go here or go there, and you go, oh, and people were starting to come back with these incredible reviews. So you have a proposition that is, on this phone, and you press the button and you can find places, so you all now take that for granted. And so that was starting to build. But what wasn't there yet was trust. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you build trust into a product. And there is both a physical and a software product. So let's talk about, so I'm going to rent a place off one of the people here that's put their hands up, right? And you're on Airbnb, so you trust Airbnb now because it's a system that evaluates each other in a fairly fair way, let's say. You give each other reviews, right? You look at the reviews to see if they're a good guest, and then you let them come, right? And you're like, oh, okay, that's great. I trust Airbnb now because there were 5 good reviews, so I'm going to give that person come and stay in my home. So then the number of hosts starts increasing. And then on the other side, as a guest, I go on there, and I think one of the most genius things they ever did was the private review. So I stay on Airbnb, right? So you go on Airbnb and you write that little note. I always think, when you go on Airbnb, you bring your best human, right? You go, oh, let me just write a nice little note. Oh, I'm just in Brussels with my little family, and your place looks really nice. I hope it's available, right? You bring your best human, and they go, oh, great. And then they've checked like what the other people said about you. And oh, they seem like nice. They didn't trash the place where they were staying before. So they seem like good people. That's a good match. Okay, great. Yep, it's available. But they could look at it and go, oh, sorry, it's full, right? Right? So you have to respect both sides of that equation. But then at the end, what happens? And this is where TripAdvisor and Yelp are all wrong. Because when you look at reviews on TripAdvisor and Yelp, it says, yeah, the waitress gave me a funny look. Well, that's helpful. They tripped over and spilt some of my coffee. Oh, that's useful. Oh, I didn't like the way, right? I mean, it was really busy. Okay, that's helpful. Anyway, so reviews actually can be amazing, but you have to create the system within which those reviews are going to be positively understood on both sides, right? And so what they did was they took the venom out of the review by making it private, right? So we were in an Airbnb recently, and I wrote a little note, and I said, actually, we had a great stay, thanks very much. A couple of things, like there's, the paint's peeling in the bathroom, and and you need to take a look at the dryer, or I don't know, whatever it was, right? Something like that. And then I go, and they come back to me and say, oh, so sorry, we'll go fix that. Thanks, I hope you had a great stay. Thanks a lot. Then you post your public review. You've got all your badness out of you. And so you go, oh, my God, it was amazing. I had a great time. There were a couple of little things, but they responded brilliantly, and it was fantastic, right? And so you can create an environment of constructive, positive interaction. And unfortunately, there's a lot of software companies that don't pay attention to that, and I'll come on to talk about that in a second. But those things need to be designed for. And so I think Airbnb is generally a force for good, and I know there are issues in certain cities and overpopulation, but there are arguments about distributing people, but I think, so these little posters here, and then I can move on from Airbnb, but these little posters here, so Brian brought me on board because he said, I want to do a launch kind of like Apple does, right? So Apple did those big keynotes, and so we worked on one together, and this was him launching the world of trips with the little icons, and each one of those trips were the thing that you do on top of the stay, right? Now, just to talk about that for 1 second, and if I put my sort of finance hat on, the accommodation business is $500 billion. Pretty big, right? Can grow quite well. The travel business is $3 trillion, 6 times bigger, right? So which business are they in? Before they were in the accommodation business. Well, I just stay there. Okay, cool. Right. Somewhere to stay. But if Airbnb can get into the conversation about travel, where else can it go, right? So I would argue I often start my searches about places through Airbnb. I'll look at the experiences that they can do through Airbnb. I might not do them, but I could see what they do. And so it's not a huge part of their business fiscally, but it's a massive part of their business from a brand perspective. Because you, like bookings.com, whatever, I don't think that's a brand. I think it's a search engine optimization, right? Every time I type something in, it comes to bookings.com. Because they bought it, right? That's performance marketing. That's not brand marketing. Airbnb pulled all their performance marketing. They invested in brand. And so they invest in their community, their hosts, some of the communication they put out there about equality and opening up the world. And so there's just different approaches to ways in which brands can be built, and I think Airbnb is a pretty nice example of a good one. It's, I think probably one of those community-driven super brands. You know, it's built by the community, and it's perpetuated by the community, but it's very intentionally built. Like that moment, my last story for Airbnb, that moment where those newspapers were saying people are trashing Airbnbs, we had this crisis meeting, we all got together and they were like, what are we going to do? Well, obviously we'll pay them back and da-da-da, and we should give them we'll always fix things, right? And we were like, look, why don't we turn this into the right headline? Why don't we tell every host they have a minimum $1 million insurance? And why don't we tell everybody that? Because we can turn this crisis into actually a recruitment opportunity because not enough hosts were coming. As I say, we'll up to $1 million, or I don't even know where it is now. It's probably something different to that. But at that time, that was what was written about. Airbnb decides to make sure no host is out of pocket, and up to $1 million will be guaranteed, and if it needs to be more, then it can be more. And so again, it's the way that you respond and interact with the product that builds the brand. Okay, I think I got through that a little quicker. So we're gonna go. How am I doing for time? Is it already like breakfast time? A little faster, yeah. No. The rest of it is fast. Yeah, you don't believe me, do you? No, you don't believe me. Okay, so these were two sort of big seminal, and I spent a lot of time with Brian and learned a lot from him, and he was a big fan of Steve, so we talked a lot about how you build a brand, and I actually think Airbnb is in some way inheriting Apple's legacy. It's like the experiential version of Apple, in a way, and so that's what he was really interested in. You might have noticed that Johnny Ive works for Airbnb. You might have noticed that a whole team of people that I used to work with at Apple are now at Airbnb, so that was somewhat intentional. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking now about my company, how we work with founders today. We're working with a lot of founders doing some really incredible things. Hopefully, I'm going to tell you some stuff you haven't heard about. Some mostly founders at the very leading edge of technology. And hopefully, I'm not going to leave you depressed, but actually kind of excited about the future. We'll see. So we're called Founder. We couldn't afford the vowels. So there was a big Chinese company that was called Founder, so we took the vowels away. And that's what it became. And we're called Founder for a reason. We work like, and this is just a smattering, and some of these guys, JC Allen is coming to speak here, I think, at some point. So he's a good friend. Actually lives in Saint-Gilles, and was from Paris, where the company is. So Rare is a playing card backed by NFTs that got launched in January, and the SoftBank Vision Fund valued them at some ridiculous number. Olivier Hopium is a hydrogen car. Olivier was the 18-year-old winner of Le Mans, the fastest hydrogen car driver ever. And so the future of cars after electric is actually hydrogen, if they can figure out how to make rocket fuel be dispersed. So that's a longer conversation, but let's not get into that. Patreon is about getting artists paid. When artists go on Spotify, they get paid virtually nothing. When they go on YouTube, they get paid virtually nothing. If you're an artist and you go on Patreon, you can get people to subscribe and pay you for your art. And I can go on. So Actually, Grow Intelligence is a really interesting one, so particularly in terms of a positive influence on the future of the world. And she is just a phenomena, Sarah. So, lady at the top there in the middle. So she was born in Ethiopia in the 80s, brought up in the 80s. And of course, I think we all remember the 80s Ethiopia, all we ever thought of was famine, right? And she was brought up in that moment. And at some point, she went to London, and then she went to Colombia, and then she started commodities trading. Because she was trying to understand commodities, because she was like, this country that I was brought up in was starving. Like, why were we starving? What happened? Like, it was the climate, it was the crops, it was the war, it was everything. But how can I help? So she has built Grow Intelligence, is this unbelievable AI platform. So artificial intelligence, it just really means there's a bunch of data in it. And the two pieces of information that she has put in one place are all of the climate data that we know about in the past. So typically in February in Brussels, it rains a lot. Oh, thanks for telling me something I didn't know. No, and then in LA, it's sunny but cold. Okay, yep, got it. And then that data with the food supply data. They know what is grown in every field in the world. Which is kind of nuts. I don't know how they did that. But, and if they don't know, they can figure it out. So they might not be able to get into Russia to sit, but they can pretty much through satellite pictures figure out that they've got wheat or barley or oats or whatever they're growing there. And they put the two together into with an algorithm. So an algorithm is just a piece of software layer that pulls data and reorganizes it for you. And so you can go in and ask a question. You could say, you know, I have a field in Belgium, and the last 3 years has been a bit too rainy for the crop I've been using. Should I switch crops, and should I do this? And it will give you a percentage projection of what the weather is likely to be like and what other crops might be right. How beautiful is that? And her personal story is so perfect, right? So she became one of the Time 100 People of the Year, and she talks now about, because I was like, you always got to, like, I understand and believe you. You have to mention, right, the fact that you came from Ethiopia in the middle of famine. That's why you're motivated to do it. And then you got to Morgan Stanley and became a commodities trader, and you saw that people were making money out of trading commodities. And she's like, neither one is good. How do I find a good, positive way to move forward? So I think Grow Intelligence is a really beautiful example. I'm going to talk about Snap a bit later. And I can go into other ones. Meaty is actually, I'm going to go into them later. So this is what we do, and I'll skip through this a little bit because this is just sort of how we work. This is how I talk about storytelling. So narrative is everything, narrative stories. And, you know, on the right-hand side is external, so it's customers and capital, right? So a lot of young companies need a good story to get capital. So we sometimes work with companies that need that. Certainly, customers need a good story to understand and fit with their value system. So design, sales, products. But actually, what's really, really interesting is the increasing role, you know, the war for talent, right? So it's kind of ironic, and I know the world is suffering from supply chain issues right now, but one of the supply chain issues are people trained in the right thing. And it's crazy, because I think everybody kind of assumed that the technology revolution would mean that there were, like, no jobs for anybody, right? But that's not the conversation. The conversation is, I can't get enough of the right people. I can't get software engineers, or I can't get whatever the people are. And so, again, people go and work for companies, and you ask the new generation, they go work for companies that are going to put a dent in the universe. They have a story, that want to do something that's positive. And so constructive narratives are always what we're looking for. We're looking for founders that have a product that can be constructive, and then we'll build a constructive narrative around it. So that's all of the things that get impacted by a narrative, both external and internal. This is the slide that kind of gets everybody, so I throw this in front of a founder and I go, so I bet you can answer this question. And they go, let me tell you. And the reason is, high growth companies, because we work with a lot of startups that are sort of on the cutting edge. They've grown like crazy, and their business is sort of ahead of their storytelling, and they suddenly go, oh shit, oh damn, they just got a bunch of funding, and they just committed to becoming this big company, and they're like, and then they turn around and look at their story and their brand and their strategy, and they're like, oh, I think we need to up-level that because it's 3 years old. It's what got us here. So what got you here won't get you there. And of course, narrative is the bridge. So I think some of the examples with Apple, some of the examples with Airbnb, as I was telling you, these new introductions of technology require a story to get people from here to here. Otherwise, they just fall down that chasm in the middle. And that's storytelling. So this is us. That's me. It's my storytelling partner, entrepreneur partner, strategy partner. We've all worked with a bunch of great people. These are a bunch of companies, and one of the things, I'm not going to talk about the companies here as much as the categories. So here's what's been crazy about the last 2 years. And funnily enough, COVID has sped up the speed of change in terms of new categories where new companies are being created. So some of these boxes on here would just simply not have existed 2 years ago. I'll go from the top. Creator. So I think we all know about that. Like, you know, whether it's Instagram or TikTok right? But hopefully there's good places like Patreon. Roblox, where kids can build their own worlds. We work with them. Biotech. So this, we're entering the age of biology. So I think a lot of the storytelling I told you before was about the age of software, and the age of software carries on. The age of biology, and just to put that very simply, let's talk about the vaccine. Well, let's not. But anyway, let's talk about how they got there, not whether it's worth getting. But so, because we work with Big Pharma, and actually we learned this from DNA from one of these companies, which was what they used to do is do clinical trials on a whole bunch of stuff because they really didn't know how biology worked. Right? I mean, it's a little oversimplified, but it's kind of true. What's happened in the last few years is now they know how to, separate a DNA strand. They know how to look at the composite parts and bioengineer a solution. That's how they came up with a vaccine within 6 months, because they were able to bioengineer it. In the past, they would have had to try this one and this one and this one and see if that one, oh, they died. Oh, shit. Oh, that's not good. Oh, those guys had no impact whatsoever. The control group didn't have any, and the clinical trials took 3 years. And then the FDA said, can you go try another set of clinical trials? And 5 years later, there's a solution. Well, the age of biology is we understand biology now, right? And of course, I'm not a biologist, so anybody who's a biologist, please don't challenge me on this area because I will crumble. But the notion is that we can bioengineer things. And so I can give you a whole bunch of examples up here, ag tech being a great example, where we can bioengineer solutions to food. We can bioengineer solutions to sustainable packaging. We can bioengineer from nature. So bioengineer, again, oversimplification, but the last 500 years since the scientific revolution has been about science overtaking nature. And I feel like there's a realization that, and that's what biology is realizing that nature is the greatest innovator of all. And if we can discover from it and work with it, and we didn't discover it, we just found it in nature. Mostly, nature already knew it. We just need to respect it and discover it from nature. But the last 500 years of human arrogance has been, right, the scientific revolution, and then science wins everything, so that was good for a while, and then it became humans are sort of, and nature has no value. And so I think it's a very interesting area where I think biology will save the world. And I'll say that. We've worked with, so there's a company up here, Inari, that are creating seeds, not like Monsanto, that are bioengineered in a bad way, but are created seeds that are good for the earth that they're grown in, not Monsanto, which created seeds that created a need for their products, so they became extremely wealthy. There's another example up here, which I can't find right now. And what they did was they used biology to eradicate, instead of having to put chemicals, you bioengineer the solution. So I think the age of biology is actually incredibly optimistic. It's where your kids should go study, because that's the future. Software is still going, but probably starting to crest. And I might argue that biology is the future. And we need it to be the future, because we just relied on chemicals, and look at what it's done to the world, oil and other resources that we've poorly used. So anyway, the top line is a lot of new foods. Oatly, hands up who loves Oatly. There's a lot of people sort of moving away from cow's milk and realizing that Oatly is actually pretty great. So we don't need all that methane coming out the back ends of cows, and we don't need to clear what is currently rainforests in order to grow soy and other things and corn that we can feed to animals. Meaty is mycelium. Fork and good is so the categories are the most interesting thing here. So so that's what I was trying to make the point here. And there are categories here that really didn't exist. Of course, climate has become huge. Every third project we seem to be doing right now. Sourceful, actually, I only spoke with the guy 3 days ago, so I'm not completely cogent on it, but unbelievably inspired. So it's an ex-Amazon guy who's creating a supply chain solution. He said most of the sustainability problems are through waste in the supply chain, right? So if you think about the excesses that you go through, right? You go, oh, just order it on Amazon and click the button, and we all tell ourselves we're not going to do that, and we're pretty good at it now. We go buy it in the store, right? I think that it is better mostly because what happens with Amazon is big box arrives with 2 little things in it, right? And then it's delivered and back delivered and back delivered and back delivered. And if you add up all that carbon, right, that was a lot. And so he's creating a platform where he knows all of the data points of all the way through the supply chain, right? So 3 years from now, if I'm up here again, I'll tell you to look for the label Sourceful on every product you buy, because it will tell you what the carbon output is. And there might be, we haven't figured it out yet, but there might be a 3, 4, and 5, and 5 is like net positive. I don't know. Maybe 4 is net neutral, and 3 is pretty good, but, a little bit of carbon impact. So I'm trying to give you the idea that, because I am a sort of future optimist, and I do believe technology has, there's very much a dystopian overview in the world right now, and of course it clouds many of our judgments, and I'm not ignoring that. I'm just saying there's also a lot of light in the companies that we're working with that are actually trying to make significant steps forward to bring the human condition and not have technology crush it, not have technology leave the human behind, but try to do good things. So we try to work with good companies that are doing good things. Some of these companies are, just doing stuff, so we give them a good story. But I think the exciting parts are the hydrogen cars, or the biology that's going to save the planet, or supply chain that's going to understand how to remove waste, and so you guys can make good decisions. I actually think part of the problem right now is there aren't any good choices for you to make, right? Oh, I go to the bio farm. Okay, good, well done. Yep, and then I only use the brown okay, good. Yeah, and then I take the bottles back. Okay, that's good. Yep, so we're doing all that. It's great. But then I go to Carrefour and just sort of grab a bunch of plastic. But there aren't any other good choices, right? And so it's the job of business to put those choices in front of you. I don't think we're going to stop people consuming. We need to give them good choices, and then they can make good choices. And I think biology is going to help us do that. Okay, I'm sure I'm way behind. So maybe I'm going to flip through this. This is a bit of how we work. It's called sort of narrative therapy. So we go through an interaction. It's mostly on Zoom, but we do live meetings whenever we can. We provoke through a lot of cultural stimulus. We build storytelling quite early, and then strategy comes out of story, which is a bit of a flip for most people in marketing. Most people think you write the strategy and then you figure out what the story is, but we're story-led, and we do it in sprints and try and do sort of big thinking in short bursts. which is a little bit back to the mantra of Steve seeing us every week. It's like, every week, make it better, make it better, make it better. So hopefully I'm almost coming to the end here and you're not falling asleep. This is a page that maybe is interesting, like if you're thinking about, if you have a brand or a company, like can you answer these questions? I think that's what a brand is, like, what's your role in culture? Why do you exist? Do you know what you're here for? Is there a positive intention? Where are you trying to go? Your vision? How are you going to get there? Your mission? Right? So I try not to use big strategy words when I talk to people, and just talk in. Steve always had this thing, is like people that use big words are trying to tell me how expensive their education was. That's what he used to tell me. He'd be like, don't use that big word, James. You don't need to use that. Find some nice little words and put them in a really good order. I'm like, okay. So hopefully I still adhere to that mostly. So this is what a good brand is. It's storytelling. Can you tell your story in 30 seconds? Do you have a single sort of 10-word articulation of who you are? And then there's always going to be different audiences that need slightly different versions of one story. You can't assume that one story will go everywhere. We think brands are a living system. They're often sort of a two-sided thing between the person that's making it and the person that's consuming it. But there's lots of different places in which that relationship is impacted. So you could look at the Apple thing and probably draw the Apple Store and products and product releases and brand films and stuff on there. And then we sort of help companies make changes if they need to. So I don't know whether I'm running out of time, and if I have already bored the living daylights of everybody, then I can stop. But I have a few more minutes. 5 more minutes? 5 and then with questions? Good, okay. Please, be thinking of your questions, because hopefully you have some. Okay, let's tell the Snap story. Snap's an interesting one, right? So I mentioned it earlier. So Evan Spiegel was actually based in Venice, California, and that's where we were living. So he used to come by every 2 weeks. He's like, I want to do what you did with Steve. Like, I'm going to come by, and so the Suburban would pull up, and he would get out, and we'd sit for an hour every 2 weeks, and for about 2 years. And he didn't yet have sort of he didn't have a C-suite. He didn't have a big marketing person or a big to have the interactions with. So it was 5 years ago. So he said, "You guys are mine until I hire it." So let me tell this story a little bit, because there's a couple of pieces in here that are pretty interesting. And for those people that don't know what Snapchat is, well, I'm going to assume you know what Snapchat is. But back in the day, around this time, social media was thought of as, and still is, right? It's moved on to TikTok and some other places. But, in general, a lot of kids doing a lot of this, and, maybe creating alienation and people having too much of a digital life and not enough of a physical life, and an interaction losing some of their EQ and their ability to interact as a human. And so there was always this list of social media companies that were bad. It's like, oh my God, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat, and I was like, and I spent a lot of time with him, and I could see that he was trying to create something different. And I was like, we have to get you out of that list. We have to get you out of that list. And I think they're out of that list right now. I don't think you list them, because everybody knows that Snapchat is a place for a few very specific things, right? The kids find each other on a map. They talk to each other, right? They do certain things. But what they don't do is have 15,000 followers. What they don't do is have influencers all over them. And so this was a classic moment, actually, because Instagram, which I'm sure you all use, had just developed a product called Instagram Stories, right? So the stories at the top now, which most people use all the time. It's actually Snapchat. I don't know whether you know, but that is Snapchat functionality. So suddenly, we were working with Evan, and he just came by. I'm like, how are you? He's like, well, I'm like, what do you mean, well, do you know? He's like, well, Facebook basically just created a new product called Instagram Stories, and it's basically Snapchat. I'm like, okay, should I have a look at it? It's like, oh my God, they literally shamelessly stole absolutely everything, chronological storytelling, like all the pieces of Snapchat right there in a soulless company called Facebook. Well, it's called Meta now because they're trying to make you feel better about them. But anyway. So I was like, look, this is not good. We have to find ways to separate you. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of how we found ways to separate them. The first one was he was giving a speech at Recode. I think that might be the picture of him at Recode. I'm not sure. Recode is a big tech conference, and I had a friend of mine was putting it on and said, you know what, actually, he's going to be up just before the Facebook guys. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be interesting, because, and Evan's like, why? I'm like, you're going to get one question, okay? Because normally what I do is give him like some talk points, and he'd ignore them, and I'd be like, I didn't get a chance to say all the points she's told me to say, James. I'm like, all right, doesn't matter. Forget all those points. There's one thing that's going to be asked of you. And here's the question. How do you feel about Facebook having borrowed, stolen, your functionality, right, and calling it Instagram Stories? And, you know, they went on to add 800 million users with Instagram Stories. Now, I know everybody uses it. That's Snapchat, by the way. That's their IP. But anyway. And so, and Evan's a particular guy who was like, you know, when I get asked how do you feel about that, I'm going to go, it's okay. It's fine. You know, we'll make something else, you know? Good for them. I'm like, don't say that. When they say, how do you feel about them borrowing your functionality, right, to build Instagram Stories, you should say, I wish they'd borrow my policy on privacy, which is exactly what he said. And that was the headline the next day. Evan Spiegel says, I wish they'd borrow my policy on privacy. And then everyone went, wait, what's Snapchat's policy on privacy? Oh, it turns out Snapchat actually doesn't do half of the egregious things that Facebook does, because they're selling your data to, right, Cambridge Analytica, the people from, you know, far right, whatever. Anyway, you know what Facebook does with your stuff. And Snapchat doesn't. In fact, they expunge your data every 6 months. So it was permission for everyone to ask that question. What is Snapchat's policy on privacy? And then we were like, oh, well, actually, we have a really good answer. So we're like, okay, Snapchat's a little bit different. And then the second thing we did was this campaign. And it's a fun one because I think after about a month working with him, we came up with this idea and I actually sent him a snap that said Real Friends. And it took 3 years later, he did a campaign called Real Friends. He was like, I should have just listened to you in the first place. I'm like, it's okay, it's fine, whatever. It took a minute. But so why Real Friends? Because on Facebook and Instagram, you can't have 15,000 friends, right? They're not your friends. Are they your friends? Anyone here got 15,000 friends? They're not your friends, right? So, and are you being real on Instagram? Maybe, sometimes, right? But on Snapchat, you're being really real. I mean, almost too real, right? If you look at your kid's snap, it's pretty real, right? And that's not always a good thing, but it's very real. So it's very real, and you follow Dunbar's law, which is that thing about intimacy, the circles of intimacy, right? Dunbar's law is like, basically when you're amongst 5 people, you're very intimate, and so you're very honest. When you're amongst 15 people, that's like a circle of trust. But beyond that, people behave differently. And they project. And of course, you know what I'm describing, which is the other social media platforms where people project. And so we did this campaign, and I love this Marlene Dietrich. It was a massive poster in San Francisco. It's the friends you can call up at 4 a.m. that matter. So we just had all these amazing quotes about friendship from amazing people. And so everyone was like, oh yeah, that's a friend. Oh, that's a friend. And then suddenly we owned real friends. And so you started looking at your other thing, and you're like, oh, I got 15,000, well, maybe not, they're not, I'm not going to call friends anymore. But so anyway, a couple of examples. We took them from being a social, hopefully something about true friendship. That's my observation of how my kids use Snap. It's their friends. They don't add people for the sake of it. They add them because they're their friends. So I think I'm out. I've already told this story, but I didn't have the slide, so sorry about that. This is the wonderful Sarah Menkler from Ethiopia, who's building that. We gave him this line, the story of what on earth is going on. What on earth is going on? Another one, Patreon, so they're getting people paid, creatives being paid, because other platforms expunge their value. Meaty is a mycelium replacement for food. So those people that know mycelium, anybody seen Fantastic Fungi? It's that amazing documentary. You should watch it. I've got two great documentaries for you that you should watch. Kiss the Ground and Fantastic Fungi. They're just both. Kiss the Ground is about how we don't treat our agriculture correctly, and biology can help us, and we shouldn't till the land and all that good stuff. And Fantastic Fungi is about, a funny story, but why did man suddenly develop to have a massive brain? And of course, some theories are that they've been eating mycelium under the ground, and some of those were magic, like some of the mushrooms that we like to eat with chocolate and on a certain night. And so that was and who knows, and no one was there 10,000 years ago, but apparently there was some role that mushrooms played in the evolution of man. But anyway, mycelium is the single largest organism in the world is a mycelium in Oregon. And anyway, it's basically the bottom part of a mushroom, right? So if you pull it up, it's a source of incredible, and you can create all kinds of products with it. So we created this whole brand around good energy. So it's a source of energy, but it's good energy, and most sources of energy are just not. Okay, I think I'm done. So rare. No, okay, one last one, and then I'm done, I promise. So this is the playing cards thing. So I don't want to talk about crypto and NFT any more than anyone else does, but it is a reality, and so we have to understand it. So this was Panini playing cards. Does everybody remember when you were growing up? The World Cup came around, and you got the little stickers from the corner shop, and you stuck them in your album, right? So this is the digital version of that, backed by NFTs. And Nicholas is based in Paris, and we launched them and gave them this line, "Own your game," and that clearly the growth in the digital world and NFTs in the art world is a whole other conversation that I'm probably not qualified to talk about, but we're going to be working with someone that's doing that in the near future. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. I hope at least some of that was interesting, and thank you for being so patient and listening in.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Okay, so we have two hostesses on either side with microphones. And I will invite you to raise your hand if you have a question so that we can all hear the question and Vincent can answer. I'll open that for you if you want.
No, I got it. I was just trying to figure out whether it was sparkling or not. No, it's all good.
Good evening. Thank you for the terrific conference. An observation, you move your hands like Steve Jobs, so I suppose you did work with him for a decade. You adopted his movements.
Really? Oh, no.
Yeah,
Anything else? Blaspheming and using bad language and...
That or having more hair. But I mean, the other question I actually wanted to ask is, when we listen to you, we really have the impression that storytelling is really about the art or the intuition or this form of qualitative genius. I was curious to hear if you had any form of validation or quants. Is it just art, or is there also a...
No, it's a great question. I don't know how many times I've had that question. Actually, it's funny, one of the co-founders at Airbnb, so there was Brian, but there were two co-founders, and Nate, who was the finance guy, came up to me and he's like, so why are we spending all this money on brand? Like, if I put $1 million in growth marketing, I know I could get another 1 million people to stay, right? Whatever the numbers were. I can see the numbers right there. I'm like, yeah, you could do that, sure. But, you're not going to grow the brand. You're not going to grow your story. That's not going to grow your IPO would be $1 billion, not $100 billion, because you were, a little growth company and someone else would have. And so it's funny because I spent time with him because I wanted to try and understand how to speak to someone like that. And he said, because I said, look, everyone tells me that you're the numbers guy. I need a number. How's it gonna shift the needle? And he said, no, James, that's not the best way to think about it. He said, I want a thesis. I just want a thesis, right? I don't want to just, it's gonna be great. I want a thesis. And so what we came to do was say, okay, here's how we think the impact's gonna be, right? And so, You know, there are some monitors that we look at, a brand tracker. Within the next 3 to 5 years, we think Airbnb's general awareness will go from 20 to 30%. We think that on the attributes of trust and da-da-da, it'll go from this to this. And it will also have a positive effect on some of the analytics, somewhere in this range, right? So I never let anybody say a number. I always said a range, because we always, who knows? So yeah, I mean, in the question is that it is a little bit hard to quantify, for sure. But the big successes speak for themselves. But yeah, it's challenging to quantify. I think having a thesis of some sort is the way to solve that.
Thank you. And the next question in the back.
Hello, good evening. I had a question because Airbnb is somehow a big part of your talk tonight.
Yes.
How long have you been working with them? When did the collaboration started? What happened since the action? Because if I may say, there was like when the attack in Paris happened, there was the first big event in Paris. Mm-hmm. And somehow, what about the storytelling? And then what about the non-storytelling afterwards? Because there's a big difference between their storytelling and what happened in the last 5 years, because there's a lot of changes from where they were, where they are, the way they work with the government,
right,
and everything.
Right. Yeah, no, I actively worked with Brian and the team between 2015 and end of 2017, so for 2 years. So I can't really speak to what's happened since. I tend to think in general they've been a good company, but there are clearly some challenges along the way, but I can't speak intimately to it. I'm still close with Brian. We do talk to each other, but I haven't been working with them since. You think? Do you want to just, for everybody's benefit, explain what you mean by that, so that everybody understands the question? What you think the change was?
If I remember well, there was a huge congress of was Bataclan. Can someone say the date of what happened in Bataclan? It's,
yep.
How many years? So that was the biggest change in communication, and afterwards the whole strategy changed in the way that it was very different.
In what way?
In what way? Of the way to work with governments, and it wasn't as free. Trying to work with regulation, gentrification,
right.
And so on and so on. So what I'm surprised in a way, as you just say, you worked with them for 2 years, and this is a huge chunk of your presentation.
What year was that you're talking about? The Paclo the Vals thing? What year was that?
Can someone tell me? That's
you want to remember
15,
that?
16.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And after that, they never had another convention. That was the bigger events that were cancelled halfway.
Right.
Because of the attacks. That was
right.
weekends.
Right.
And so I like the storytelling, but that storytelling didn't work.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know how to answer that question, because I didn't have.
We were there. A lot of people, and then the story was ended, and there was no follow-up to that. So for me, it's kind of interesting storytelling.
Okay. I don't have an answer for it, so it wasn't on my radar. I mean, obviously the event was on my radar, but I didn't witness or talk about a change in behavior from that company at that time. So.
Thank you. We have another question here in the back.
Yeah. Good evening. Sorry if this is a far too personal question, but why Brussels?
Because my wife Marie is from Brussels, and my kids are half Belgian, and because it's a really cool place to live, full of wonderful people. Yeah, it was in the middle of COVID, right? And so actually, I think it came down to the schools were closed in California, and we were like, this is ridiculous. We can't have our kids at home on an iPad. That's not right. And we were already sort of a little bit panging for a bit of European experience, both for ourselves. I'm British, she's Belgian, and our kids who were Californians, so we wanted some other experience. So, and of course we know tons of really fantastic people here just because we've been coming here on and off for the last 20 years. So it's been a great experience. The weather's not awesome, but other than that, the people make up for it.
And just as a quick follow-up on that, running a business as international as yours, do you find it a good place to be based?
You know, I mean, you know, Zoom, right? So the only not good part is that time zone-wise, most of my meetings are between 4 and midnight. So you know, I was doing a call just before I came down, and I'm probably doing a call in an hour or two, I don't know. But yeah, because it's daytime now in California, so that's the challenge. But Zoom means you can be anywhere. So actually my CMO is based in Amsterdam. My chief writer is in Rio de Janeiro, and you know, most of the team is in Venice. But as long as you don't mind time zones, it doesn't matter because, I mean, literally they can't be together right now anyway because of Omicron. So, any other questions?
Yes. I wanted to ask you, when you come up with an idea or when you get to this, you know, aha moment, let's call it that way, are you usually surrounded by people, or or most of the time are you alone? I'm just curious to know.
I mean, you know, I don't think any of those ideas were in isolation. I don't think I'm not sitting there in a room going, oh my God. There were parts of conversations with a team of people, you know, and I actually don't think giving me a blank sheet of paper is my thing. I think in a conversation and interaction, I can steer it somewhere and then find something in that and go, that thing. What about you just said real friends. What about real friends? Or you mean real friends, right? Oh yeah, real friends. That's cool. Oh, wow. Don't go there. Don't go there. Live there. 1,000 songs in your pocket. That was the brief I wrote, right? So, I mean, I'm not like a pure creative, really. I'm a bit of I don't know what I am, sort of a bit of everything. But I'm quite good at being sort of an alchemist in a way. And I think as long as you surround yourself with really creative people, so my team, super creative storyteller, great strategist, great entrepreneur, and together we always come up with stuff, and we're always like, oh, I don't like that. Oh, that's cool. And we build on and we challenge each other, and it's through that we get to it. So that's why I wanted to show the team, because I don't come up with this stuff in isolation, and I never really did. So I need people around me. I can't take credit for it all. So.
Thank you for that question. We have another one just here. Wait, behind you here first. There was a man here in the front. Just there. Thank you. And then one last at the back.
You don't need to pay people to ask questions.
I was wondering if you had any other examples of how language builds brand, both externally towards customers as well as internally, to build that culture that reinforces your brand within your company.
How language can build internal and external culture. I mean, I'm scared to use the Airbnb example now, because anyway. But Brian used to ask the question, you'd have a meeting and be like, who's hosting this meeting? First time I was like, I don't know. Like, it's like, and then and then I realized, and I was like, oh yeah, I brought some cookies, or someone baked a cake, or, oh, we're hosting this meeting. And that was like, because what he wanted to do was everybody working in the company to feel what it was like to be a host. And so you had to host meetings. Who's the host? You know, it's a simple, like, but whenever you can find things like that help you empathize and understand the connection between external and internal language, that's maybe a decent example.
Another question in the back.
I have a question. When you said in interviews that when you left Venice for Brussels, it was also part due to the political climate in the US pre-elections. What would you advise on non-business leaders in terms of storytelling?
Wow. That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's really sad what is happening in the US, and it's actually really sad what's happening all around the world in the political system. That democracy is, you know, the end of history as written in 1992 never came to pass, and actually liberal democracy is under threat, and technology is not helping, and powerful forces that are governments, that are certain cliques of super wealthy people are supporting the democracy being pressured. And I mean, I see that everywhere. I don't know, Brexit, I mean, give me a gun and let me shoot myself in the foot. Like, that's what my country just did with Brexit. We just ordered a North Face jacket from the UK, and then we were hit with like a €50 tax, and then a VAT, and then a customs thing, and I'm like, I'm not ordering from the UK ever again, right? So, and that was all because, because of the perpetuation of separation of, of politics being used as a football, of social media creating difference, and, a bunch of people finding people in their village speaking another language but not understanding, because the movement of people, and a lot of people wanted to go to Britain, and so, but people stoked that fire. A lot of the social media companies are making money out of dissension, right? I'll stay on your media channel for longer if you show me something really like, conspiratorial. So QAnon, right? The recommendation engine on Facebook pops housewives into QAnon. Everybody knows what QAnon is, right? It's the conspiracy theory that apparently Pizzagate and Hillary Clinton is running a child pornography ring or something. Not very believable, but anyway, lots of people believe it. Apparently, I don't know what the number is, but it's large, believed that the last election was not fair and yet, right? So independent sources said it was the fairest election in the history of American politics. So anyway, yes, I do think, I don't know, I can't remember what the question is, but I would personally say...
Knowing those problems,
we did move for that reason, to get out of the, right? And so it is refreshing to be here, because it's more civilized. But I also see it. And so
what would you advise to non-business leaders to actually help tackle that?
Yeah, I knew there was a tough question there somewhere. Oh my God. The destructive narratives, right? You're up against a lot of nationalism and populism is based on scapegoating people and creating fear and dissent. And, I often say, like, if you get lost in a city, where do you go? You go back to the last place you knew. And I think a lot of cultures are trying to do that. They're like, Brexit was like, well, we used to be Britain and strong, and what happened? Where are all these people with funny accents? Let's go back to where we were when we were, that's been a couple of centuries since that happened. So that was not easy to go backwards to. America, let's make America great again, And so I just think what I think we have to make as powerful as those negative is constructive narratives, is build positive environments, atmospheres where creativity and where inclusion, because we're probably just as guilty of not being as inclusive, and break down the fake news or and help to build those places that are safe harbors so people can find a good source of information that isn't driving them to extremism, which I think is increasingly happening around the world, and is particularly seen in the US, which is one of the reasons why we left for at least a minute. So yeah, I think try to find constructive narratives, try to build a positive sense of the future. And I think people are lost, and they're also a little scared by the future. The future feels very uncertain and very scary. And obviously COVID hasn't helped at all, because it's told us all to step away from each other, which is literally told us to step away from each other. And so the communal aspect, I don't even know what a hug or say hi or kiss or whatever. Like, I mean, what are we teaching ourselves, right? So all of those things. So yeah, I would recommend that that we try to build safe places where there's real information, and we try to educate and convince and build constructive narratives around countries that are positive, and find ways to unscramble the negative. So that doesn't mean that's easy.
We're going to have one last question in the back, and then so you're not disappointed, there will be a more informal conversation at the bar afterwards. So don't worry if you have more questions.
I think they're
But
done.
you want to.
They've had enough.
There you go.
Hello, James. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Just one question about this storytelling for founders.
Yep.
How long does a story last? Because it's a chapter in the cycle of a company. So it's a very specific moment. It might be a decade for Apple. It might be with the founders where you position the company, etc. But for instance, how long does this last? And might you consider come back to one of your clients? Would you work today within the Tim Cook chapter for Apple? Would you come back? Would you feel good to do that?
Yeah. I don't think they're a bad company. So I continued working with them for a little bit. But to answer your question, yes, there are definitely cycles, right? So, and, you know, the Apple story is a 40-year story. I think that's pretty impressive, you know, and most brands go through smaller, shorter cycles of being popular for 3 to 5 years and then sort of losing their impetus. And it's often down to a certain leader that then moves on, or a certain, and so you have to try to get the narrative into the DNA of the company so that it goes past a single leader and it's built into the fabric of the company, so that the company in its very being sort of does the right thing, and tries to not, you know, make bad decisions. And so, but yeah, no, it's not, you know, I'm not suggesting you put a plaque on the wall in every committee room, because that's really not going to work. That's going to have no impact at all. So it has to be a set of values that people understand, and that's why storytelling is the right way to do it. You have to keep telling stories. And so, you know, you lose your way, tell some stories, get people back to understand where we're going. Even if the boss just left, find another way to express that and get people behind it. I think those are brands, those are story-led brands.
Thank you very, very much, everybody. A warm round of applause for James Vincent, please. And now I invite you all into the stables behind us to have a nice drink around the bar and more informal chats and get to know one another and ask all the questions you like. Thank you. Oh, and there's food and drinks available at the bar, so please take a look at the menus.